Hello, and welcome to the Adventures on the Can-Do podcast. I'm your host, Jothy Rosenberg, aka the Incorrigible Entrepreneur. Adventures on the Can-Do explores the challenges and rewards of entrepreneurship, overcoming adversity, and where grit and perseverance can get you. My new book, Think Like a Startup Founder, based on my experiences founding 9 startups, seeks to help early-stage founders avoid the many pitfalls founders can experience along the way. This podcast adds to that stories of many fascinating founders who are my guests. You can see all the episodes of this podcast on my website, jothyrosenberg.com. Also, please follow and rate us at podchaser.com/adventuresonthecan-do. Today's episode is a bit different. I have no guest today. It's just me. I'm doing a solo one because guests and others have been asking me to tell my story here so that podcast listeners can get that context. So to do that, I'm going to answer the following 9 questions. Where does my grit come from? What is my theory about why disabled people tend to overachieve that my TED Talk was about? Where does the phrase, the rallying cry, if you will, "Who says I can't," even come from? What is the Who Says I Can't TV show about? I'll put the link for that in the show notes. What is the Who Says I Can't Foundation? What is the origin of my startup itch? What is my new book and who is it for? What is Adventures on the Can-Do Trail? And what is my idea for this Adventures on the Can-Do podcast?
Where does your grit come from?
I love talking about other people's grit, but I rarely get a chance to talk about how my grit came about. So it came about because when I was 16, I was in high school in Michigan, and it was October, we had a gym class that was focused on jumping rope. And I like jumping rope, actually, a lot of fun. And I was in midair when my right knee bent. And so therefore, when I landed, it wasn't in the right position, and I crashed on it, and it was so excruciatingly painful. And so everybody in the room knew something bad was going on. And they called my dad. My dad's a surgeon, and surgeons, well, doctors in general, when they treat their kids, they think they know everything about medicine. And so he said, "Oh, big guys hurt their knees all the time. I'll just put an ace bandage on it, and take it easy, and it'll be better." Except that it's almost impossible when you tell a 16-year-old to take it easy for them to follow that advice. And my older brother thought he would take advantage of it. So he would do things like he'd kind of run by me and punch me in the shoulder, knowing that I wasn't supposed to chase after him, except I would. And then I heard it again. Anyway, that happened for over and over again. And then finally in December, I was walking the dog, and it had snowed, and then it had rained, and so it was slick as could be, and I fell, and that was the last time I walked. That was when I had to drive by, so my right leg was useless, and I jammed the umbrella on the accelerator and used my left foot on the clutch and the brake, and somehow got back to the house. And just laid on the horn, and my parents came out and said, "We're taking you to the hospital. We're going to get a biopsy." And so a couple hours later, we knew that it was a bone cancer that's really rare, called osteosarcoma. It focuses, or that's probably not the right word, it affects teenagers. And there's only about 1,000 cases a year in the United States out of 320 million people. They said, "You're staying in the hospital. We're going to prep you for surgery." And I said, "Not so fast." My mom was a what's called a surgical pathologist. So her job every day in and day out, was to support a surgeon who was doing a biopsy to see if something needed to be, cut out. And they would cut a sample. She would look at it under the microscope and then tell them what it is. She would make a diagnosis. And I said, I'm not doing this until my mom looks at it and says, my leg has to be amputated, which was a really hard thing to do to your mother. But she did it. And then she came back and she told me there was no option, that I had to have it amputated. And I had to hear that. And everything was a blur, and I had the leg amputated the next morning. And then was in, the ICU. And that at that moment, from then on, I was trying to figure out what I could do. I was very sports oriented. We skated. I did, neighborhood touch football and baseball, and we were a skiing family, and all of these things. I was asking people, am I going to be able to do this? And everybody said, no, you can't. No, you can't. I was hearing can't constantly. This was very demoralizing because I already had to figure out just how to even stand up and balance. And so it was just this wave of negativity coming at me. First of all, this was cancer, but chemotherapy for it had not been invented yet. And they warned me that it gets into the bloodstream. So, I had something else to worry about. And I was just, given some crutches, and I was given how much time to stay home and try to heal. And I actually insisted on going back to school sooner than they had said I could, because I just didn't want to sit around constantly. And that was weird because, first of all, none of my friends visited me in the hospital. I had one friend from a previous school that visited me. That's the only one. It was, so that hurt. And none of those friends ever had anything to do with me ever again, because it was really hard for them to see the change in my body. It was, people were afraid. Some people thought you could catch cancer back then. This was 1973. So when I got back to school, it was on crutches, because now they know better. They fit you with a prosthesis right away. It helps the healing, but they didn't do that then. And as I'm walking down the hall, and it was between classes, it was packed with kids, but they were jumping out of my way over each other like I was parting the waters of the Red Sea. It was just really hard to deal with that. And so what I did figure out pretty quickly was that there were things I could start to do that helped me feel better about myself, because your self-esteem is at an all-time low. And one of them was just to start going further and further and further on crutches. And I took on the job of walking our golden retriever after school every day. And I would take him to a park, and we would go quite a ways. And eventually and we would go to Maine in the summers, and they have some big mountains on this one island we were on. And I would go to them. I would climb these things on crutches, and I would wear down the arm, and I would get blisters on my hands. So I had to figure out how to deal with that. But it was this thing started to happen where I discovered that if I just focused and worked hard at something, even something that seemed as simple as crutch walking, that I could actually do better at it than anyone ever anticipated. And that was the most encouraging thing. So I insisted. So the surgery was in January. And then in March, before the season was over, I insisted my parents take me to our little local ski hill. And in Michigan, they're little tiny things because Michigan is flat. They were a little nervous about it. By the way, the things that we use nowadays, which are forearm crutches with ski tips on the end, they're called outriggers. They had not yet been invented in 73. So I had the standard pointy poles, which aren't very helpful because you can't lean on them, because if you're moving, then the point is there and it goes behind you and it's not going to help. And the other problem is that in skiing, we say that you steer with your big toe. Now, I've been skiing since I was 5, so I was half decent. And so when you say you're steering with your big toe, it meant that the right turn worked because it was my left ski that I had, and I was steering with my big toe, because you got the ski mountain, and when you're turning on that hill, you're on your edge and you're steering with your big toe. But the left turn meant I had to steer with my little toe, which doesn't work. I mean, well, it doesn't work until you learn. So basically what would happen is I would get up off the snow and I would make a nice turn to the right. And as soon as I tried to turn the other way, I'd fall. And again, and again, and again. And my parents were so worried that I was humiliated by this experience. But in fact, at the end of the day, I said, wow, I'm so excited. And they said, what do you mean? I said, I will be able to do this. I just have to work really hard at it. I can figure this out. And they were like, oh, wow, this is a weird kid. But just continuing the grit. So the grit wasn't there yet. I mean, I had a lot more to figure out, but I finished high school kind of lonely because there were no friends. And there was one friend, and I should mention this, is that in my senior year, I was now on a prosthesis, and I was really, really interested in this one girl, Sarah. And I finally got up the nerve to ask her out on a date. And she said yes. And so that's like, oh my God, I have to go through with this. Now, my parents had bought me a car. It was this sort of a funky car. It's called a Ford Maverick. But it was my car. And so it was fantastic to me. And so I was able to, I picked her up and I took her to a movie. And the movie was the rock opera Tommy by The Who. I was excited about it. I love The Who, and I love the whole story of the deaf, dumb, and blind kid, Tommy. And so off we went to this movie. And we both went into our respective bathrooms. And as I came away from the sink, there was one of these cheap rugs there. And my prosthetic foot got caught under like a little curl in the rug. And so when I moved forward, my leg didn't come with me. And it's like, oh, I see, it's stuck. And I yanked as hard as I could. And it came, my leg came forward. But when it came down on the ground, it landed on a bare bolt. And I looked back and the foot was still there. The bolt had just sheared off. And now I didn't have a foot. And so I reached down and I picked up the foot and I hopped out of the bathroom, and there was a bench right there, thankfully. And I'm in shock, thinking, oh my God, this is the most humiliating, horrible experience I could ever have had. And I'm holding the foot out in front, and a guy comes out of the bathroom, and he came with a swirl of smoke. And you know what that means. And he looked down at me and he said, wow, man, did that hurt? And for a minute, I saw the humor in the situation, but I still was like, what am I going to do? I don't know how to get into the movie. I don't know how to get out to the car. But Sarah came out of her bathroom and she said, oh, I see what's going on. I know just what to do. And she ran away and she came back and she had a huge roll of masking tape and she made me a masking tape ankle. And it worked. I used her sort of as a cane, and I shuffled into the movie. Obviously, it didn't work like a normal ankle on a prosthesis, but it held together. All right, so graduated from high school, got into college, went to college, and the first thing I did when I got there that first fall semester was I started asking every girl I met. I mean, sometimes I wouldn't ask their name, and I would ask them to dance because I love to dance. I'd been okay at it, and I wanted to do it again. Very, very hard to do with a prosthesis because you move around like that on a dance floor, and if you don't stand on that leg with the knee straight when you put your weight on it, it's not locked because it has to be straight and weight bearing to lock. And so if you stand on it when it's the tiniest bit bent, boom, you go down like that. And so I would ask a girl out to dinner. For some reason, I thought I needed to pay for dinner and dance. I could have skipped that step, but it was a very expensive semester. And we'd go up and we'd start dancing. Sometimes it was to a jukebox, and sometimes it was to a band. And we'd start dancing a little bit, and then I'd make a mistake, and boom, I'd fall right on her feet. And usually she would say, "Oh my God, this is horrible." And we weren't drinking a lot. I mean, we were allowed to drink because the drinking age at the time was 18, but we were just drinking a beer, nothing much. So she couldn't figure out what was wrong, and I would say, "No, let's keep going." But usually by the third time I fell on her feet, she said, "We got to sit out. We're done." And I would never have a second date with a girl, so I had to do it with someone else. And I actually dated 40 different girls in 10 weeks. Eventually, I got dancing figured out. But one of the things about this cancer, remember, they warned me that it gets into the bloodstream. Every 6 months, I had to go in for a chest x-ray and a blood test to check to see if the cancer had spread. And it just so happened that this one day, I had gone in to have my wisdom teeth removed from one side, top and bottom. And while I was in that hospital, it was the same hospital, I had the checkup. And I was still groggy from the numbing and whatever they did for the oral surgery. And a woman walked in and said, "You won't be going home after this. You're going to come upstairs. We're checking you in. The cancer has spread to your left lung." And that was devastating because now it seemed like it was going to just keep eating away at different parts. And it was an emergency again. Had the lung out the next morning and had a long recovery. And I missed a semester of school. The new thing that was just out was chemo, and they put me on it and made my hair fall out. It was made you very, very sick. And the doctor I had not had a lot of experience with chemo yet. He said, "Well, we're hopeful. We're going to try it, but no one has ever survived when they had cancer in the bone and then it spread to the lung because, well, it's true. Once it did that, it was spreading all over." So unfortunately, my 19-year-old brain heard, "You have zero chance of survival." So that was bad. And the chemo lasted, was 10 months. And then I decided not to go back to school. I decided that what I was going to go do is ski in Utah, a place I loved, ski until I dropped dead. And so I drove. I didn't even ask permission. I just packed up my car. It was December 6th. And I drove all the way to Utah, never even thinking I should call ahead and try to get a job. I was just going to show up on the doorstep. And I went right to the place that we'd been to, and I saw how they worked, and I saw how the ski bums there worked and how much skiing they got. And I just went in and I said, I want a job. And the owner was a woman, and she said, "Have you looked outside? Do you notice that we don't have any snow and we're not open yet? And so there's no jobs." I said, "Oh no, what do I do?" And I only had saved $1,000, so it would have gone really fast if I wasn't careful. I had to figure out, somewhere to go that was free. And luckily we had relatives in LA. So I went there for about 3 weeks, and then it finally snowed, and I went back, and she got me the job. And it was great. You lived in fairly tight quarters, but room and board was free, seasons pass, and $100 a month spending money, which I spent on beer and foosball. But I skied 100 days straight, and I finally perfected that left turn. It's 3 years after the amputation, but I'd skied a bit, but I was just not quite getting it. But I had some help. There was a ski instructor who decided to take me under his wing, and he put his right foot in a little cage that he built on the back of his boot, and he had outriggers just like me, and he was on his left leg, and so we did it together, and he was just the most beautiful, smooth skier, and I accomplished skiing. And at that point, the world changed for me, because I was now a better skier than most two-leggers. And the feeling that gave me, I describe in my TED Talk, was a feeling of exceptionalism. And I was boosted up, and I just had to hope that the chemotherapy had worked. And because the snow melted and I wasn't dead, and I couldn't think of anything better to do, so I went back and finished college. That's the grit story.
That's going to be a wrap for today. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of Adventures on the Can Do podcast. Remember to share and like us on your social media channels, and check out the show notes for additional resources and links. I'm Jothy Rosenberg saying, hasta la vista.